Last year, it was pretty clear which phone Apple wanted you to buy. Sure, the iPhone 8 was a huge success, but Apple wanted their customers to want features like an emoji and Face ID and that beautiful, albeit notched display. But this year is a little different. Both the iPhone XR and XS are successors to the iPhone X, so both phones have all the same features of the iPhone X. Well, mostly, we'll get into that later. But with both phones being so similar, it might be hard to decide which one to get. Well, I've spent a few weeks with both phones, and I'll tell you exactly what I think. Now let me start off by saying that both these phones are great, and you can't go wrong with either one. But that's a pretty boring thing to say, right? You want to know which phone I'd rather pay money for and use day after day. Well, honestly, it's pretty simple. The iPhone XR offers almost every feature of the XS. If you could live without an OLED display, and yes, you can, then the choice is pretty clear. Go save $250 and go with the XR. But it's not that simple, because even if it starts at $1,000, there are a lot of things to like about moving from a XR to a XS. Obviously, that display is a pretty big upgrade, but there are a few other key differences that separate the two. Now, as far as design, the only real material difference here is the frame, which is aluminum on the XR and stainless steel and polished on the XS. It's a very small change, but it actually makes the XS feel like a very high-end piece of tech, because while the frame is metal, it feels like it's glass, and it makes the entire phone feel like this futuristic glass slab, which I guess it is. In comparison, the iPhone XR has a great anodized aluminum frame, which is less slippery and allows for nice colors like this beautiful red. But in my opinion, it's just not as nice to hold as the XS. So aside from the frame of the phone, the other design change is the size itself. I said this in my review, but the XR feels like a true plus-sized iPhone X, with bigger videos and larger Instagram cats to like. It's a big phone without being overbearing. But I actually like the size of the XS more. It packs that large 5.5-inch screen in a very small body. In fact, this is the smallest phone I've used in years, but the screen is the same size as my last phone, the iPhone 7 Plus. And don't worry, the iPhone XR is still a great fit in the hands, but the XS is almost always a one-handed phone. Come to think of it, that seems pretty futuristic too. Of course, let's not forget the differences in the display either. The iPhone XR has a great LCD display that Apple calls the Liquid Retina, which is the greatest marketing name I've ever heard. But the XS has an OLED display called Super Retina, and it's better in every way. It's got great color, amazing contrast, and pure blacks. But sure, the iPhone XR might not have an OLED display, but this is still a great looking screen. Unless you're looking for pixels or are just actively trying to hate the screen, you realize this is still a great display. And speaking of premium, the iPhone XS keeps 3D Touch while the XR ditches it. Now, nobody actually needs 3D Touch, but there are some places where it's really nice to have, like on the lock screen. The buttons feel super fast and fluid. The iPhone XR manages to cope with some touch and hold gestures, but they're just not as fun. Now, as far as cameras, there just isn't all that much to talk about. Both the XR and the XS have the exact same specs on paper. The only difference, of course, is the single lens. The XS has both a wide-angle and telephoto lens, while the XR only has the single wide-angle lens. But if you want that closer shot, you can always zoom in the old-fashioned way. That's with your legs. So these are some of the biggest differences I've noticed between using the XR and XS, but I think I should highlight some of the ways the XR feels just as good, or better than the XS. First is that A12 processor. I keep saying it, but this phone will run as well as the XS for years because Apple didn't cheap out on the processor. Keep it up, Apple. Next up is the speakers, and while I didn't sound all that excited in my other videos, I freaking love it when smartphone makers improve their speakers. In fact, the HTC One is probably my favorite phone ever, and part of the reason is because I never thought a phone could sound good. And both iPhones get that improved audio with better clarity, more volume, and even a little bass. Now they're not going to replace a Bluetooth speaker or even fill a large room, but you can watch videos and listen to music and hear a lot more of what's going on. It's such a nice upgrade. And speaking of upgrades, if you're concerned about battery, then the XR is the way to go. Since it's pushing less pixels and still gets that super efficient A12 processor, the XR will get about 2 hours more screen time than the XS, even beating out the XS Max by an extra hour of life. So yeah, the iPhone XR has some pretty fantastic specs. It's much more affordable and it comes in a whole rainbow of colors. If you're in the market for a new phone, it's really hard to recommend anything else. But I actually like the XS more. It comes down to form factor, which I prefer for its smaller one-handed size, the OLED display, which is really hard to give up, and just the way the phone feels like a solid piece of glass in my hands. With all that said, which one should you get? Probably the iPhone XR. It's got the same camera, just one less, the same processor, a bigger battery, and best of all, it costs a lot less.